Now we have an extra guest from the previous session, and so I invite Monica at the University College London, and so she will talk about also historic center, and so speaking about heritage and innovation. So we thought that was also good to continue with your presentation.
Great. Fede and Monica, sorry, maybe if I can take a minute, because
sure.
I have to leave at 5 for faculty budget meeting, no, the choice you are having. I excuse, so I won't join you for the discussion, and just wanted to say now, that many thanks for this whole day. It was really super interesting, and I'm looking forward, for possible further points of collaboration and connection. And well, I wish you a nice last presentation and a good discussion then, And well, many compliments and thanks to Fede, for organizing all this. It's absolutely amazing.
Thank you for this great opportunity and for
in advance, no? Perfect. And now, Monica, stage is yours. Many thanks.
Thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I uploaded it just to make sure that it's
no
working. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and all the presentations have been so interesting, and yeah, I hope you enjoy mine as well. My name is Mónica López Franco. I'm finishing my studies, my PhD studies at the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL. And I will be talking about urban renewal heritage in the historic centers of Mexico City and Guadalajara in the Mexican context. So basically, the basis of my research, it comes from the shift from heritage buildings conservation to urban conservation. And this is thinking of cultural places as places that have different dynamics within them, and thinking that tourism is one of those dynamics, but there are others. For my research, I used the Foucauldian tradition of discourse analysis to basically locate space as a representation of discourse and a site to argue and or present discursive realities. This was a qualitative study, and I used primary data with interviews with government officials, academics, residents, but also policy documents and census data. So this research was mostly drawn from the data that I gathered mostly from interviews. So this is where both historic centers, both cities are located. And yeah, so these are two photos of the touristic areas within both historic centers. The historic center of Mexico City was built on top of the Aztec city by the Spanish when they came in the 16th century. And Guadalajara was built from scratch in the 16th century as well. So these are the areas that are usually the ones we associate with both historic centers. However, as I said before, these are not homogeneous places. In my research, I consider them as heterogeneous because we have many different contexts and realities within these historic center areas. And one of those things that we see is that there are a lot of pockets of poverty and social and urban challenges. So the Historic Center of Mexico City, this is a very boring photo when you think of the next photo that I'll show you, but it basically has one delimitation. It was given by the National Heritage Conservation Authorities, and then it was confirmed when it received UNESCO World Heritage Site title, and it's the same area that is used for planning strategies and agendas. And I will be talking more later about this, the corridor Regina. In Guadalajara, there are different delimitations. This historic center is not eligible for World Heritage Site title because it has been modified across the years. So we see one delimitation for heritage conservation institutions, and then another delimitation from urban development planning institutions. For the city, it is the planning delimitation that I used for this research, but that's only because it's the only one that considers a planning approach to the area. However, in the area, we do have a World Heritage Monument, and there is another area that was sort of recognized for the Creative Cities Network for UNESCO. And there's the corridor of Mezquitan that I will also talk about later. Basically, in my research, I identified this governance model where it's basically to do with public sector and private sector investment, where public investment is mostly given to the public space, basically the monument zones. And then we have the monuments. These are semi-public private properties that you can only access in a limited scope of time, and they can usually be invested on by public or private sector, depending on the type of building and the property ownership structure. But then we have private properties, which are usually, and I here consider in terms of housing, and these are mostly assessed by the private sector, and the local authorities have very little, a very small role in this area. So to start assessing the spatial and also the community implications for the approaches to both historic centers, the main thing to understand is the barrio structures within each historic center. These are barrios or neighborhoods. Each of them are recognized at the social citizen level to have different economic and cultural identities. And they are important because they have shaped the way dynamics have sort of evolved inside of historic centers. And they have recently been integrated into planning instruments for both areas. As you can see, there is a difference between the monumental core areas where the first photos I show you, these are the touristic areas, but then the rest of the historic center has housing dynamics where we can usually find some social and urban challenges. However, thinking about the barrio structure, when we look at housing development potential assessment by the planning authorities, we can see that the barrio structure is not really the one guiding urban renewal strategies. So it is mostly along very specifically identified and designed corridors as a new social and urban unit that urban renewal is being assessed. So this creates a bit of a conflict to start with, because we are looking at urban renewal units that are creating new centralities within a historic center centrality. So going back to the interviews, it was interesting to see what people considered as negative and positive factors when describing the historic center. It was interesting to see that in terms of negative factors, officers, academics, and residents were all in general agreement, where abandonment and dereliction were the ones that were considered as most challenging generally. But then when talking about positive aspects, officers and academics considered the delimitation of the historic center as the most valuable aspect. And this goes back to a cultural monuments-based identity of the historic center. And it's contrasting with what residents highlighted as more valuable, which was sense of place and basically the communities and social roots within the historic center. So this widens or this sort of evidences a gap in understanding for why the value of the historic center exists. So then from there we go to how urban renewal and housing strategies are being assessed. So basically, based on negative indications, I encapsulated all of them and named them deterioration challenges. They are consistently mentioned whenever an urban renewal agenda or a housing development potential proposal is described. So I consider this to be a problematization of the historic center to sort of assess an opportunity. In this sense, going back to the corridors that I mentioned before, this is Corridor Regina in Mexico City, and this is the outcome of that urban renewal strategy. And it was basically an urban improvement project where facades, lighting, the street level was changed. There was an integration of street art and a lot of the hospitality services changed along that corridor. This has presented challenges for the residents along these corridors. And along with all of these changes, housing tenure and property ownership of buildings has also been altered. And this has created challenges for, especially for longstanding residents of the areas who are traditionally on the low income spectrum. A similar story is happening in Mezquitan. So this is a project that is still ongoing, but it's a very similar situation where the street level has been changed, facades have been fixed, street art is being introduced to sort of introduce also different hospitality and leisure dynamics along the corridor, and housing tenure and property development is also expected to change. So basically what is happening is based on negative descriptions. The left photo is what is usually associated to housing in historic centers, which are usually called vecindades, low income flats or rooms for rent that are located in buildings that are usually deteriorated because property owners may not have the capacity to invest in them or interest. And the new urban renewal agenda is promoting so basically housing developments like the photo on the right, where we have introduced density, but also we have also the projection of a different type of tenant or property owner as well. So we are seeing changes in contract types, household changes, but also the type of investment incentives for property owners. So this is a question of who is urban renewal of historic centers in Mexico being promoted for, and always keeping in mind that there are existing communities in these places, and so what is going to happen with them? One of the things in this research that became important was to identify the different types of residents. So the longstanding resident, the resident that has lived in the historic center traditionally, and different generations before them, I positioned them as a first wave resident, and they are basically embedded in community dynamics. They are the ones that recognize the barrio social spatial unit, and they have sort of been the people that have fostered and continued the spatial traditions within historic centers, even though they are deteriorated. So even though the places themselves are deteriorated, we do have strong community dynamics still existing. Then we have a second resident wave, which is the one that has been brought on by urban renewal agendas. And it was interesting to see that as time has gone by, this resident has started to integrate into historic center community dynamics, even though they do have other dynamics of their own, mostly to do with work dynamics and a different type of lifestyle. However, it was interesting to see that across residents, but also officers and academics, there was the expectation of a new resident that hasn't arrived yet, but who is expected to change the social fabric, basically, of historic centers, but and not only the social fabric, but also property values and the sort of continuation of an urban maintenance that is not reliant on local authority investment on the public space. This is the third wave.
1 minute.
I'm almost done. So this is the third wave resident. This is supposed to be a young resident and professional who, as they move along in different stages of life, they will move outside of the historic center. And therefore, there will be a constant replacement of residents. And this is just to show the changes in the housing rent market, just to show that from 2008 to 2019, the rent has increased significantly, and it's mostly out of reach for first and second wave residents. So what has happened is that communities, especially in Mexico City, have mobilized to sort of contest and try to remain in historic centers due to these processes. There have been several movements, especially across social media, which is incredibly relevant now because of the pandemic, because this has meant that there are platforms that are being mobilized to sort of continue an effort to not be displaced from the historic center as these processes are happening. These are just some photos. And basically the findings, my conclusion would be findings suggest that the Barrio Social Spatial Unit would actually promote the appropriation of an urban renewal and housing redevelopment process that is more based on community dynamics and residential needs across social groups, where basically the real complex realities are being addressed rather than being replaced by new sort of potential dynamics that are assessed as more positive. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, also for this presentation. So we are very glad to hear about your research.